The first rays of dawn stretched across the Pacific, glinting off the water like shards of silver. But the air over naval amphibious base, Coronado, carried a chill that bit through even the thickest layers of sweat-soaked fatigues. New recruits stumbled onto the gravel and sand, their packs dragging, boots clanking against concrete. Some exchanging nervous laughter, others glaring silently at the grueling week they had been warned awaited them. Among the throng of young men, all taut with nervous energy, arrogance, and bravado, walked a woman who seemed to belong nowhere and yet somehow belonged everywhere. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Halden adjusted the straps of her pack as she stepped onto the base. At first glance, she looked no different than the recruits around her. The same olive drab uniform, the same standard-issued boots, the same water-stained hat pulled low over her eyes. But anyone who had ever seen her in action would have known she carried more than mere physical endurance in her bones. She carried the quiet weight of countless missions, calculated risks, and the kind of discipline that could break ordinary men without them ever realizing it. Today, no one knew her. Today, she would observe. Today, she would walk among wolves in plain clothes, unseen, underestimated. The whispers began almost immediately. A few of the younger recruits noticed her gait, calm, measured, almost detached. She didn't stumble over her pack, didn't shout, didn't laugh. Some snickered. One, a tall kid with too much bravado and a crooked grin, muttered to another, "Look at her. Bet she can't make it through Hell Week. Probably just here for some admin crap." The words carried across the gravel, bouncing between sun-baked buildings like a stone in a pond. Ray didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that arrogance was a tool she could sharpen, a weapon she could allow others to wield against themselves, while she remained untouchable. In the showers later, the true test of courage began. Steam rose from concrete floors, and water splashed violently against tiles as recruits laughed and shoved, mocking anyone they deemed weaker. Some of the men made jokes about the girl, their voices loud and crude, thinking that a female presence would shatter their bravado. She stood among them, silent, letting their laughter bounce off her like raindrops off armor. She didn't shrink. She didn't retaliate. She simply observed names, faces, weaknesses, strengths, who laughed too loudly and who avoided confrontation, who led through fear and who tried to hide behind it. Her mind drifted briefly, as it often did before missions, back to a time when silence meant survival. Syria, a village charred by war, dust rising in choking clouds, and the echo of a brother's voice, the last words he spoke before he fell in an ambush. Lead them. Ray, make them count. That memory was a cold knife, but it was sharpened into purpose. The young men laughing in the showers were not merely recruits to her. They were the challenge. They were the battlefield she had been sent to conquer. But not with bullets, not yet. With leadership, discipline, and the slow, merciless grind of respect earned. Night fell over the base, blanketing the grounds in a quiet tension. The young recruits collapsed into their bunks, exhaustion pulling their muscles taut, their minds buzzing with anticipation for the trials that awaited them. Ray, meanwhile, sat alone in her quarters, the walls bare, save for a small secure laptop and a phone that buzzed intermittently with encrypted messages. One message had come today, terse, official, and heavy with expectation. Maintain cover. Observe. Evaluate. Report. She read it twice, feeling the familiar stir of adrenaline in her chest. The world beyond these walls was chaotic and unpredictable. Here, she had a chance to shape order from chaos, to mold these recruits into the kind of warriors her brother would have been proud of. As she stared out over the ocean, she could hear the distant crash of waves, the endless rhythm of tides that had watched countless seals come and go, broken and reborn. She felt the pull of the horizon, the call of the missions that had taken her to the edge of life and back. And she understood with crystal clarity that this assignment was just as critical. These men were young, reckless, arrogant, a powder keg of energy that could destroy itself without careful guidance. And she would be that guidance, unseen, unyielding, unshakable. The first night passed in silence, punctuated only by distant shouts from the base and the occasional thump of a dropped pack. Ray slept lightly, one eye always open to the world around her, attuned to the rhythm of the barracks, the cadence of breathing, the subtle tells of fear and confidence intermingling among the recruits. Her thoughts wandered to strategy, who to observe closely, who might rise to leadership naturally, who might break under the first pressure. Every detail mattered. Every detail would shape the outcome of the week to come. Morning came abruptly. The chill had deepened overnight, mist curling over the edges of the base like ghostly fingers. Recruits were called to assembly for the first drill, a grueling combination of surf, sand, and calculated exhaustion designed to strip away all pretense. Ray moved with calm precision, watching the men stumble and scramble, noting each hesitation, each misstep. She kept herself in the shadows, letting their arrogance blind them. Already, whispers about the girl persisted. Already, some began to doubt their own abilities when she completed exercises effortlessly, her movements precise and controlled, like a predator in its natural element. By midday, the recruits were spent, bodies trembling, teeth chattering from cold and exertion. Laughter that had once seemed fearless now carried undertones of uncertainty. Some glanced at Ray, expecting weakness, but saw nothing. Just a quiet focus that unnerved them. They laughed anyway, a nervous laugh, masking instinctive recognition that she was not what she seemed. Ray allowed it, letting their confidence dig their own grave, knowing the lessons would come soon enough. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Ray stood on the shore, watching waves pound the sand. She flexed her fingers, feeling the familiar ache of muscles that had endured far worse. She remembered every mission, every decision, every life lost and saved. She understood the stakes and the irony of the situation. These men mocked her, laughed at her, underestimated her. Yet by the end of this week, they would not be laughing. They would be learning. Because Lieutenant Commander Rachel Holden was no ordinary officer. She was a SEAL. She had commanded troops in the deadliest zones on Earth. She had seen fear, loss, and chaos firsthand and survived. She had returned to teach, to mold, to correct, and to lead. And the recruits, the boys who laughed in the showers, who thought a woman was out of her depth, had no idea what was coming. Night fully descended. Ray returned to her quarters once more, checking her equipment, reviewing notes, planning the day ahead. A deep sense of purpose settled over her. The mission was not just about survival or physical strength. It was about reshaping minds, forging respect, and instilling the kind of discipline that could withstand the impossible. These recruits would test her patience. They would test their limits. And in the end, she would emerge as their commander, their mentor, the leader they never knew they needed. And tomorrow, the real Hell Week would begin. The sun rose pale and gray over the Pacific, casting long, wet shadows across the beach. The recruits stumbled to formation, still half asleep, bodies stiff from the previous night's exertion and cold. The salty wind cut through their damp uniforms, searing their skin like icy knives. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Holden stood at the edge of the sand, silently observing. Her presence went unnoticed. She wore the same standard-issue uniform, had pulled low over her eyes, face expressionless, letting the men assume she was just another recruit. The first drill of Hell Week was deceptively simple on paper. A long run across the sand, into the surf, then back up over the dunes, repeated until exhaustion overwhelmed every muscle. But the reality was merciless. Waves pounded them without mercy. Cold water gnawed at their bones, and the wind whipped sand into their eyes, blinding and relentless. Some recruits fell into the surf, coughing and sputtering, shivering uncontrollably. Their breaths came in short, ragged bursts. Laughter erupted from the stronger men at first, mocking the weak. Ray moved with precision, rhythmically, her every step calculated to conserve energy, her movements effortless, yet lethal in their efficiency. She was silent, her face unreadable, her eyes scanning constantly. When a recruit, a thin, pale boy with shaking arms, fell into the surf, Ray was already there. She grabbed him under his arms, hauling him out of the water without ceremony, without fanfare. He coughed, sputtered, and looked up at her, eyes wide with shock and gratitude. She gave him a brief nod before disappearing back into the line of recruits, indistinguishable once more. No one else had seen. No one else had noticed. By midday, fatigue had begun to take its toll. Muscles trembled, lips cracked, skin flushed and pale in rapid rotation as the recruits alternated between burning energy and freezing in the surf. Many began to question their own strength, their own resolve. They looked at Ray, expecting weakness, and found none. She moved through the drills like a machine, never tiring, never flinching, never complaining. The murmurs began, whispers about her pace, her endurance, her uncanny ability to remain untouched by exhaustion. In the showers that evening, laughter erupted once more. The recruits, wet and shivering, tried to regain some sense of bravado. They made crude jokes, mocking her presence, calling her the girl who couldn't possibly survive the real trials. Some splashed water in jest, pretending to intimidate her. Ray stood among them silently, her eyes calm, unyielding. She said nothing, letting their arrogance and ignorance fester, knowing that their laughter would eventually turn into something else, respect earned the hard way. As the day wore on, Ray's mind wandered to memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Syria, the dust-choked village, the ambush, the smell of smoke and blood, the roar of explosions. Her brother's last words echoing in her mind. Lead them, Ray, make them count. Her jaw tightened. Every movement, every decision, every observation she made with these recruits was informed by those words, by that promise. They were not just boys testing limits. They were a challenge she had been sent to master. She had trained under far worse conditions, faced threats that dwarfed Hell Week, and survived. These men would either learn or break. Night fell, and the recruits collapsed into their bunks, bodies twitching with exhaustion, minds buzzing with adrenaline and fear. Some whispered to one another about the ghost in their ranks, a silent, efficient woman who completed drills effortlessly while they struggled. Some began to doubt their own abilities, seeing in her a reflection of their weaknesses. Ray lay on her cot, eyes open, listening to their restless breathing, feeling the tension, the arrogance, the fragile self-confidence. She made a mental map of each recruit. Who would falter? Who would rise? Who might break entirely? And who could be shaped into a leader? The next morning brought no reprieve. The sun barely pierced the thick clouds over the ocean, casting the world in a gray pallor. The recruits were called to a live fire exercise. Weapons, precision, and split-second decisions in a controlled chaos designed to test instinct, composure, and fear management. Lieutenant Mason Briggs, loud, cocky, and self-assured, immediately tried to dominate the exercise, barking orders at weaker recruits, displaying bravado that bordered on recklessness. Ray moved silently, correcting small mistakes, stepping in at critical moments without fanfare, always ensuring safety without compromising discipline. During one particularly dangerous maneuver, Briggs misjudged a shot and sent a bullet too close to another recruit. Ray's voice cut through the chaos, sharp, cold, and unwavering. "Safety off again, Lieutenant." The men froze. The instructors exchanged subtle glances, some barely concealing a smile of recognition. Ray's presence was more than physical. It was authority, calm under fire, precision honed by countless missions and dangers far greater than any SEAL training. Briggs's smirk faltered for a moment. He didn't understand who he was dealing with, not yet. As night descended over the base, a storm rolled in from the ocean, wind howling through the barracks, rain slapping against tin roofs. The recruits huddled together, exhausted, wet, and aching, but still clinging to bravado. Ray, however, lay awake in the corner of her quarters, listening to the storm and reviewing notes in her mind. Every recruit was a puzzle piece, every strength and weakness catalogued. Her memories returned again. Syria, her brother, the chaos of combat, the deaths she couldn't prevent, the lives she had saved. She drew strength from these memories, letting them sharpen her resolve. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the sand dark and glistening. The recruits lined up, eyes bloodshot, muscles screaming in protest, but still moving forward. Ray joined the line, calm, composed, every movement deliberate. The drills resumed, more grueling than before, pushing the recruits to the edge of endurance. She observed quietly, saving her interventions for critical moments, letting the weaker candidates fail in minor ways so they would learn, and stepping in to prevent catastrophe when lives could truly be endangered. The recruits began to notice her efficiency, the quiet way she anticipated obstacles, corrected mistakes without raising her voice, maintained composure under brutal conditions. Some began to whisper, speculating about her past, about how she seemed almost untouchable. But no one suspected the truth, that she was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Halden, a seasoned SEAL who had commanded troops in war zones, survived ambushes, and carried the weight of loss and responsibility on her shoulders. To them, she was simply another recruit, silent, efficient, and unervingly composed. As night fell on the second day of Hell Week, Ray walked along the beach alone. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, carrying away the echoes of the day's exhaustion. She flexed her fingers, feeling the familiar ache in her muscles, remembering the countless hours of training, the missions, the losses, the triumphs. She thought of her brother, of the promise she had made to him, to lead, to train, to mold warriors capable of surviving chaos and thriving in it. She whispered a vow to herself and to him. They will not break. They will rise. And with that, she returned to the barracks, stepping into the shadows among the recruits, silent, unseen, underestimated, and ready. Because Ray Halden did not merely endure Hell Week. She observed, she planned, and she prepared to transform mockery into respect, weakness into strength, and boys into warriors. Tomorrow, the real trials would begin. The sun had barely risen over Naval Amphibious Base Coronado when whispers began circulating like wildfire through the barracks. The recruits, still raw from the brutal first 2 days of Hell Week, eyed each other warily. They were exhausted, muscles aching, throats raw from yelling in cold wind. Yet a new topic occupied their attention, the silent, precise, and unervingly calm woman they had been mocking. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Halden moved among them as if invisible, yet every small action, every careful observation, carried weight beyond the comprehension of the young men around her. By midday, rumors had grown louder. "Did you see her yesterday?" One recruit whispered to another. "She's faster than anyone else. I swear she barely breaks a sweat." Another added, "Yeah, and she's correcting mistakes. Even the instructors notice." Laughter followed, but it was nervous, tinged with doubt. The arrogance that had sustained them during arrival was cracking under the weight of reality. Ray did not respond to the whispers. She never needed to. Observation was her weapon, patience her armor. Lieutenant Mason Briggs, tall, loud, and self-assured, was the first to voice skepticism openly. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered, pacing the sand during morning drills. "Just another trainee. Probably some administrative type they shoved in here for propaganda." His tone carried challenge, arrogance, and unearned confidence. He mocked her in front of the others, calling out orders she didn't actually give, laughing at their imagined audacity of having a woman among them. Ray watched silently, noting every micro-expression, every lapse in judgment, and every misjudged action. The day's exercises began with live fire drills, designed to test instinct, control, and composure under pressure. Recruits lined up along the makeshift firing range, the salty wind cutting against their faces as they balanced rifles, scanned targets, and listened to shouted instructions. Briggs, eager to dominate the scenario, barked orders at weaker trainees, his pride making him reckless. He wanted to prove himself, to assert authority over those he deemed inferior. But Ray's quiet presence was already guiding the exercise. Her corrections were subtle, yet effective, shifting a weapon here, adjusting a stance there, all without raising her voice or drawing attention. When a live round went dangerously close to another recruit, Ray's voice finally cut through the chaos. "Safety off again, Lieutenant," she said, the words precise, measured, and ice-cold. The range fell silent. The instructors exchanged glances, recognizing the authority in her tone, though none dared speak it aloud. Briggs froze, the smirk fading from his face. He realized, perhaps too late, that this was not a woman to be underestimated. Ray stepped forward briefly, adjusting the target alignment, her movements sharp and confident, before returning to the shadows. The recruits whispered again, this time with apprehension, unsure if what they had witnessed was normal or something beyond comprehension. By afternoon, the tension in the barracks had thickened. Rumors became almost mythic. The ghost in their midst elevated from silent observer to legend in a single day. Some began speculating about her past, guesses ranging from elite special ops to intelligence work overseas. No one knew the truth. Her past missions, classified and unspoken, remained locked away, secrets carried in the weight of her eyes and the confidence of her movements. She had fought in combat zones far beyond their imagining, survived ambushes, led men into danger, and emerged unscathed. To them, she was just a quiet, impossible enigma. But the enigma was deadly. Briggs, unable to contain his frustration, sought confrontation. After drills, he cornered her near the edge of the beach. "Why don't you speak up?" he demanded, voice rising with equal parts curiosity and arrogance. "Why don't you tell us what you're actually capable of? Or are you just pretending?" Ray turned slowly, her calm gaze locking on his. She said nothing, letting his impatience and anger build. Her silence was more powerful than any shouted command, forcing him to reflect, to question, to doubt. He didn't know it yet, but he was already learning a lesson far greater than any drill could teach. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of blood orange and violet, Ray observed the recruits navigating a complex obstacle course. Mud clung to uniforms, muscles screened, and lungs burned. Some faltered, some thrived, but all were learning to anticipate the unpredictable. Ray moved silently beside them, correcting errors subtly. A shift in posture here, a slight adjustment in angle there. Every correction was intentional, teaching discipline, focus, and self-awareness. She was molding them quietly, invisibly, with the patience of a master sculptor, shaping rough stone into fine form. The evening brought showers and the inevitable laughter, though the tone had changed. Mockery still lingered, but uncertainty shadowed it. The recruits began noticing her physical and mental endurance, the calm precision with which she handled chaos, and the quiet authority she exuded, even when doing nothing at all. Some stole glances, trying to reconcile the image of the woman they had mocked with the perfection they were witnessing. Anxiety mixed with admiration, confusion tangled with respect. The dynamic of the group was subtly shifting, though few realized it yet. That night, Ray returned to her quarters alone, listening to the distant roar of the Pacific waves crashing against the cliffs. Her mind mapped each recruit, evaluating their strengths, weaknesses, and potential. She thought of the lessons to be taught, the challenges yet to unfold, and the transformations that would occur. Memories of Syria crept in, missions gone wrong, ambushes, chaos, and the weight of loss. Her brother's voice echoed in her mind once again. Lead them, Ray. Make them count. Every step she had taken in this new environment was to honor that promise. She reviewed mental notes about Briggs, the others, the dynamics of arrogance, fear, and resilience. She knew that some would break under pressure, that some would rise naturally, and that a few could become leaders if guided correctly. Tonight's observations were invaluable. The whispers, the nervous laughter, the subtle glances, all data points. Hell Week was more than physical endurance. It was a psychological war, and Ray had been trained to fight in that arena as well. By midnight, the barracks were silent, save for the occasional groan of exhaustion or the slap of wet clothes drying on metal racks. Ray sat in the corner, still alert, reviewing her plans for the next day. She understood the stakes. These men underestimated her now, but by the end of this week, the dynamic would change completely. They would not only see her as competent, they would recognize her as authority, experience, and leadership incarnate. And they would respect it, because respect earned under fire is stronger than fear, and she was preparing to test them in ways they had never imagined. The first cracks had begun to appear. The arrogance of youth was giving way to the slow, inevitable awareness that the silent observer among them was far more than she appeared. And Ray, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Holden, the woman they had laughed at in the showers, smiled faintly to herself. The training had just begun, but the tide had already turned. Tomorrow, the challenges would escalate. Mistakes would have consequences. Limits would be tested. And the men who once mocked her would begin to realize that they were no longer in control. She was. And in that quiet realization, the seeds of transformation had been sown. The horizon glimmered faintly with pale streaks of light as the recruits stumbled toward the beach for the morning assembly. Their bodies ached, minds hazy from sleepless nights and relentless drills. Hell Week had already taken its toll, leaving blisters, bruises, and a simmering tension that coiled through the ranks like a living thing. Yet a new energy pulsed beneath the exhaustion, curiosity, unease, and the gnawing realization that someone among them might not be what they seemed. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Holden walked among them quietly, her gaze steady, observing faces twisted in confusion, arrogance, and growing doubt. The recruits shuffled into formation, wet sand clinging to boots, hair damp from the morning fog, uniforms stiff with salt water. They glanced at one another, murmuring in hushed tones about the ghost among them, the woman whose presence they could no longer ignore. Ray stood silently, her posture perfect, shoulders squared, her calm an anchor amidst their jittery energy. For the first time, no one laughed. A few muttered quietly, double-checking their calculations, their movements, their timing, as if her mere presence could alter the laws of nature. The base commander arrived without ceremony, his boots striking the concrete in sharp rhythm. The recruits snapped to attention, expecting another grueling day of drills and exhaustion. But the commander paused, his gaze sweeping across the formation until it landed on Ray. The quiet intensity in his eyes hinted at recognition, but no one knew the reason. Ray moved forward, stepping into the open. The morning light caught the insignia on her uniform. The seal patches, previously hidden under her standard trainee gear, now visible. The recruits froze, uncertainty and disbelief washing over them in a tidal wave. A few whispers rose, stifled quickly by confusion. "Wait, is that?" One recruit muttered. She's... Another voice cracked as the reality began to sink in, but no one dared speak it aloud. The commander's voice finally cut through the silence. "Attention. This is your commanding officer, SEAL Team Commander Rachel Halden." The words echoed across the sand, bouncing off the buildings, the cliffs, and the waves. A stunned silence fell. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying away the tension in the form of salt and spray. Gasps erupted from the ranks. Some men stumbled backward, eyes wide, mouths open. Laughter, once so constant and confident, disappeared instantly, replaced by disbelief and shame. Briggs, who had spent the last 2 days asserting dominance and mocking the woman, froze. His jaw tightened, pride and arrogance collapsing in an instant. His mind reeled as he struggled to reconcile the image of the woman he had underestimated with the reality before him, the commanding officer of the very SEAL team training them, standing quietly, flawlessly, unassailable in every sense. Ray's voice, calm and controlled, cut through the murmurs. "Your real training begins now." There was no anger, no boast, only authority wrapped in a quiet certainty that made the recruits' stomachs twist. She didn't need to shout or assert herself. Her presence, her precision, and her reputation, though unknown to them, were enough. Every man in formation felt it. She had been observing, evaluating, and learning about them, and now the veil was lifted. They were no longer equals. They were under command. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Eyes that had once laughed now followed her every movement. Whispered questions and uncertain glances replaced jokes and bravado. Briggs clenched his fists, trying to maintain composure, but every nerve in his body told him that the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The other recruits, sensing the same shift, straightened involuntarily, as if the simple act of standing upright might earn a fraction of the respect they now knew they needed. Ray moved down the line, nodding subtly to those who had shown resilience and effort, ignoring the fearful or weak. Every gesture, every glance, carried unspoken judgment. She recognized potential, raw, untamed, and full of errors, but potential nonetheless. She had trained men before, in some of the deadliest environments imaginable, and she knew instinctively who could rise under pressure and who would crumble. Her eyes met Briggs's briefly, calm yet piercing, and in that silent exchange, he understood he was no longer the alpha by default. She commanded now. The commander continued to speak, outlining the day's objectives and exercises, but the recruits barely heard him. Their minds were caught up in a whirlwind of awe, disbelief, and sudden humility. The woman they had mocked in showers, laughed at during drills, and assumed was less than them, was now their leader. She had observed every weakness, every mistake, every lapse in judgment, and her authority was absolute. Ray's instructions were clear, concise, and impossible to ignore. Today, we begin with leadership exercises. You will pair with those you respect least and work together. Mistakes will be noticed. Weakness will be corrected. Adapt or fail. Her voice carried the weight of experience, and each word cut through the fog of fatigue and arrogance like a sharpened blade. The recruits, who had mocked her mere hours ago, now followed her with a mix of fear, uncertainty, and reluctant admiration. The first pairing exercise revealed the fractures in their ranks. Briggs was forced to pair with recruits he had belittled, confronting the consequences of his prior arrogance. Some stumbled immediately, their lack of cohesion evident. But Ray's calm oversight allowed subtle correction. A hand here, a nod there, a whispered suggestion, guiding them without overt intervention. By the end of the drill, the recruits were exhausted, yet a quiet understanding had begun to form. They were learning, whether they liked it or not, under the most exacting of tutelage. By the afternoon, the recruits' perception of Ray had shifted further. They noticed her every movement, the way she adjusted a posture without a word, how she maintained composure even in chaos, how she assessed without judgment yet corrected with precision. Whispers of disbelief had turned to murmurs of admiration. Some of the braver recruits dared to steal glances, secretly noting her skill, endurance, and the quiet authority she radiated. She was unyielding, unshakable, and undeniably in command. Even Briggs, who had spent 2 days trying to assert dominance, felt the slow, creeping erosion of his control. His usual bravado faltered as he followed her instructions, noting that every correction she offered was precise, deliberate, and aimed not to humiliate, but to teach. Respect, long withheld, begrudging, and earned in small, deliberate increments, began to take root in his consciousness. The shift was subtle but profound. The hierarchy he assumed existed was realigned, not by force, but by competence and unassailable authority. As the sun dipped low over the Pacific, the recruits were gathered once more, muscles screaming, hearts pounding, minds racing. Ray stood at the center, silent, observing, noting the shifts in attitude, the moments of humility, and the sparks of potential that had emerged. Hell Week had already tested their bodies, but the revelation of her rank and skill had begun to test their minds and spirits. Respect, discipline, and obedience were now under her control, cultivated not through fear alone, but through undeniable mastery. That night, as the barracks fell silent, whispers of her true identity still echoed through the ranks. The men replayed the morning's events, the revelation, the commanding presence that had shifted the balance irreversibly. Even the boldest, loudest voices now carried caution, uncertainty, and a dawning recognition that the woman they had laughed at in the showers was no longer a peer. She was their leader, their commander, and the standard by which they would be measured. Ray, meanwhile, sat quietly in her quarters, reviewing notes, cataloging observations, and planning the next phase of training. The first crack in their arrogance had formed. Tomorrow, she would push further. Mistakes would be revealed. Leadership would be tested. And the recruits who had mocked her would begin the long, arduous journey from disbelief to respect, and ultimately, to loyalty. In that quiet moment, staring out over the restless ocean, Ray allowed herself a fleeting thought. The mission had begun. She had been revealed, but the true challenge was just beginning. These men, once mocking, would learn quickly. Under her command, every second mattered. Every mistake had consequence, and every lesson was designed to forge them into warriors. And Lieutenant Commander Rachel Halden was ready. The dawn arrived sharp and unforgiving, brushing the beach in pale gold as the recruits lined up for another grueling day. Muscles still trembling from yesterday's revelation, they carried not just the weight of fatigue, but the dawning awareness of the woman standing among them, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Halden, the SEAL they had mocked, laughed at, and underestimated. The shift in the ranks was palpable. Eyes avoided hers at first, then slowly sought guidance, as if drawn to a force they could neither resist nor comprehend. Ray stepped forward, scanning the line with the precision of a predator studying prey. "Today," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, "we test your ability to work as one. You will pair with the person you respect least and execute a series of drills as a team. Fail, and you fail the group. Hesitate, and you learn nothing. Act with discipline, and you may survive Hell Week." Her tone carried no room for argument, only expectation, and the recruits understood immediately that her words were law. Briggs, face taut with frustration and disbelief, felt a flash of panic. He had assumed he could maintain control, dominate drills, and assert his authority, but every glance at Ray reminded him of the devastating gap between arrogance and competence. Today, he would be paired with recruits he had belittled, forced to confront weaknesses he had ignored, and most painfully, follow commands from the woman he had once dismissed. He clenched his fists, swallowing pride and panic, knowing that survival now depended not on ego, but on obedience and cooperation. The first drill began with a navigation exercise through the dunes, surf at their backs, and the ocean wind biting at exposed skin. Every recruit felt the sting of exhaustion as Ray's eyes tracked each misstep. When Briggs tried to force the pace, pulling ahead recklessly, Ray's calm voice pierced the chaos. Slow down. Observe. Adapt. Failure comes from impatience. He bit back a retort, realizing instantly that any defiance would be met not with anger, but precision, a correction that would expose his weakness to all. As the day progressed, the exercises escalated. Obstacle courses, timed sprints, and endurance swims pushed the recruits past physical and mental limits. Ray remained a silent sentinel, intervening only when necessary, but every small correction carried the weight of authority. She adjusted posture, repositioned hands on rifles, or subtly guided someone through a tactical movement. The subtlety of her leadership was more devastating than any shout or punishment. It revealed their shortcomings while modeling perfection, forcing the recruits to learn without realizing they were being taught. Midway through the morning, disaster struck. A trainee panicked during a submerged swim drill, flailing violently and risking drowning. Without hesitation, Ray dove into the surf, cutting through the waves like a streak of steel. Her arms encircled the struggling man, hauling him up with precision, commanding him to calm down with a tone that brooked no argument. Within seconds, he was safe, breathing but shaken, aware of the silent authority that had intervened. The group watched, all replacing fear, and the whispered rumors of her past feats began to take on the weight of reality. By afternoon, the recruit's perspective had shifted further. Ray's methods were exacting, but effective. The weakest performers began to improve, correcting errors they had made for weeks. Those who had been arrogant learned to yield to someone whose skill and experience dwarfed their assumptions. Even Briggs, once a relentless critic, started to grasp the lesson. Leadership was not about noise, intimidation, or dominance. It was about precision, calm, and unwavering command. Her every decision, her every action, carried authority that could not be ignored. During a break in the drills, Ray pulled Briggs aside, eyes locking with his. "Leadership isn't about being loud," she said softly but firmly. "It's about direction, discipline, and clarity. Your pride is not your strength. Discipline is." Briggs felt his ego fracture beneath her gaze, replaced by a reluctant admiration he could neither voice nor fully understand. The realization struck him harder than any physical exercise. She was shaping him, teaching him, forcing him to confront not just Hell Week, but his own flaws. As evening fell, Ray's presence continued to dominate. The recruits, exhausted and muddy, lined up for final drills, simulated combat scenarios designed to replicate battlefield chaos. Communications were limited, terrain uneven, and challenges relentless. She observed quietly, interjecting only when mistakes threatened to escalate into failure. Her guidance was subtle, her corrections surgical. Slowly, the recruits began to move in sync, responding to one another with an efficiency they had never known. The lessons were not easy, but under her watchful eyes, they were effective. Night descended like a curtain over the base, yet the recruits' minds were still racing. The woman they had laughed at in showers, mocked during drills, and assumed was weaker than themselves, had reshaped the day entirely. She had demonstrated physical prowess, mental acuity, and an unshakable authority that none could contest. Fear had begun to evolve into respect, and respect into the first seeds of loyalty. Even Briggs, still simmering with wounded pride, could not deny it. She was in command, and her methods were flawless. Ray returned to her quarters as darkness settled over the base. The ocean's waves crashed relentlessly against the shore, a rhythmic reminder of persistence, patience, and inevitability, qualities she embodied fully. She reviewed mental notes, cataloging each recruit's strengths, weaknesses, and adaptability. The first phase of transformation had begun, but she knew the real work was only starting. Hell Week was not just about survival. It was about forging warriors capable of executing orders flawlessly under extreme pressure. Her role was to prepare them, guide them, and ultimately lead them. In the quiet of her room, Ray reflected on her brother's voice, echoing from a past mission. Lead them, Ray. Make them count. The promise had guided her every decision today. The recruits, once arrogant and dismissive, had begun the slow, painful process of transformation. She had taken mockery and turned it into attention, incompetence into learning, arrogance into respect. Each man had glimpsed the edge of her capability, and each would be forced to confront it in the days to come. Tomorrow, the intensity would escalate. Mistakes would have consequences. Cooperation would be tested to its limit. And those who had doubted her, who had laughed at her, mocked her, or resisted authority, would face the full measure of her leadership. For Ray, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Halden, this was no longer just a training exercise. It was a mission, a test of wills, and a chance to mold the future warriors of the SEALs with discipline, precision, and unwavering command. By the time the recruits returned to the barracks, silence had settled over the group. Whispers were replaced by contemplation. Eyes, once brimming with defiance, now carried hesitation and uncertainty. Respect was being earned, quietly but irrevocably. The woman who had been mocked in the showers had proven herself not only capable but indispensable. Under her command, their understanding of leadership, discipline, and teamwork was being rewritten, and the slow, relentless process of transformation had begun. As Ray settled into her quarters for the night, the faint hum of the ocean filled the room. She allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, tempered with resolve. The work was far from complete. Tomorrow would bring new trials, greater challenges, and higher stakes. The recruits had seen her authority. Now they would see her discipline, her strategy, and her unyielding expectation for perfection. And when that day came, the boys who once laughed at her would either rise or break, and she would lead them through it. And so, Hell Week pressed onward, relentless and unforgiving, as Ray Halden, SEAL Commander, prepared to guide her team through every trial, shaping their fear, arrogance, and weakness into something stronger, sharper, and unbreakable. The early morning fog clung to the beach like a heavy blanket, chilling the recruits to the bone. Muscles screamed in protest from consecutive days of Hell Week, and minds teetered on the edge of exhaustion and defiance. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Halden stood quietly at the water's edge, observing the recruits as they prepared for the day's exercises. Her presence was calm, precise, and unwavering. Every man knew, deep down, that she had the skill and authority to dominate the training. Yet some, particularly Lieutenant Mason Briggs, bristled at her control. Briggs had tolerated the last days of relentless drills, exhaustion, and silent observation, but the revelation of her rank, combined with the subtle corrections she had administered, had wounded his ego. He had been a self-proclaimed alpha in the ranks, loud, aggressive, and arrogant. Yet Ray's quiet authority had reduced him to doubt. Today, he decided, he would challenge her. His pride demanded it. He walked toward her as the rest of the recruits gathered, muscles tensed, fists clenched, teeth gritted against the chill of the morning surf. "Commander," he barked, loud enough to carry over the waves. "I don't understand why you're hiding behind silence. You're just one person. You can't possibly control all of us by just standing there." His words were sharp, charged with anger, frustration, and desperation. He looked around at the others, hoping for nods of agreement, some support for his challenge. But all he saw were uncertain faces, whispers, and the first signs of respect that had begun to grow for the woman they had once mocked. Ray turned to him slowly, her gaze piercing. Her expression was calm, unwavering, unyielding. "Leadership isn't about shouting over others or proving yourself," she said, her voice even but authoritative. "It's about direction, discipline, and clarity. You've been loud because you feared you'd be ignored. Now you realize you have no control over the team. I do. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can lead effectively." Her words landed like steel in the surf, unrelenting, unassailable. Briggs stiffened, anger giving way to confusion. But he wasn't ready to yield. He stepped closer, fists trembling. "I've been through more than most of these guys. I've led missions, survived hardship. You can't just—" His words were cut off as Ray raised her hand slightly. A subtle gesture, yet charged with the authority of someone who had commanded troops in life-or-death situations. The rest of the recruits froze, sensing the tension, feeling the weight of command radiating from her. "You're right," she said, voice steady. "You have been through hardship. But this isn't about your past. This is about what you're capable of now. And right now, your arrogance is a liability. Fix it, or your mistakes will cost the team." The subtle precision in her tone, the quiet authority, and the absence of anger unnerved Briggs. He realized he could not simply overpower her verbally or physically. Her command wasn't enforced by strength or volume. It was enforced by experience, precision, and the unshakable certainty that came from having survived far worse than a few days of Hell Week. His chest heaved, pride battling the dawning respect he couldn't deny. Ray's gaze softened slightly, yet remained firm. "Pair with the recruit you respect least. You'll lead them through the next drill. Follow through or fail. Your choice." Briggs turned toward the other recruits, face burning with embarrassment. He was paired with the very trainee he had belittled most, a lanky, quiet man who had been struggling with the drills. The exercise involved a night navigation challenge, moving stealthily through uneven terrain, across rocky cliffs, and avoiding simulated enemy positions. Failure would mean physical punishment, and in some cases, humiliation. The recruits groaned, fatigue evident in every movement, yet they obeyed, knowing that Ray's watchful eyes would punish mistakes without mercy. As they moved through the terrain, Briggs quickly realized the magnitude of the challenge. Every decision, every pause, every misstep was noticed and recorded by Ray's precise observation. He barked instructions at his partner, but the corrections she had taught him subtly began to guide his approach. He began to listen rather than dominate, to anticipate rather than react. Slowly, begrudgingly, he realized that authority was not about ego, but about responsibility, precision, and awareness. Ray had forced him to confront his arrogance head-on, and it was painful, humbling, and transformative. Hours passed in grueling silence. Fog thickened, waves crashed in the distance, and every recruit's muscles screamed in protest. Mist covered the terrain, making navigation treacherous. Briggs's partner, initially uncooperative and fearful, began to move in sync with him, following his increasingly disciplined instructions. The first glimmers of trust emerged. The exercise became not just a test of endurance, but a test of leadership, teamwork, and humility. By the time they reached the extraction point, exhaustion had fused the pair into a functioning unit, and Briggs, though silent, acknowledged Ray's lesson internally. When all pairs finally returned, Ray called the recruits to assembly once more. She scanned the line, her eyes landing on Briggs. "You have learned something today," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Arrogance will not lead. Ego will not save lives. Discipline, awareness, and cooperation will. Remember this." Briggs, muscles shaking, teeth clenched, barely breathed, but a flicker of understanding passed over his face. Respect had replaced defiance. Humility had replaced pride. Transformation was beginning, and Ray had guided it with subtle but unyielding authority. The evening brought another challenge, a team combat simulation in near darkness, with limited visibility and simulated hazards. The recruits moved as instructed, hesitant at first, but gradually their movements became fluid. Ray intervened only when necessary, correcting silently, adjusting tactics, and guiding them through the chaos with a calm precision that left no room for doubt. Every small success, every adjustment, every corrected error was noted, cataloged, and integrated into her assessment of each recruit. By nightfall, the recruits returned to the barracks, drenched, exhausted, and humbled. Briggs, in particular, felt a strange mix of relief, admiration, and lingering pride. The woman he had challenged, dismissed, and underestimated had completely dominated the day, proving her authority without anger, without shouting, and without unnecessary force. Her command was absolute, her methods precise, and her leadership transformative. The men whispered among themselves, realizing that the mockery of days past had been replaced by a hard-earned respect that would only grow in the days ahead. Ray returned to her quarters alone, listening to the ocean's relentless rhythm. The waves mirrored the day's trials, unyielding, persistent, and exacting. She cataloged mental notes, analyzing every recruit's response to challenge, stress, and leadership. Briggs had learned humility. Others had learned obedience, and all had learned that she could not be undermined. She reflected briefly on her brother's voice. "Lead them, Ray. Make them count." Every decision, every subtle intervention, every exercise had been shaped by that promise. As she prepared for the next day, Ray knew that Hell Week was far from over. Mistakes would continue, physical and psychological limits would be pushed, and loyalty would be tested. The recruits had glimpsed her authority. Now they would confront her strategy, endurance, and the relentless standards she demanded. Those who had doubted, laughed, or resisted were learning the most important lesson of all. Leadership is earned, not given. And Ray Halden was a master of earning it in the harshest way possible. Night settled over the base like a thick blanket. Recruits collapsed into bunks, silent now, minds racing with the lessons of the day. Whispered discussions turned to reflection. Fear, respect, and admiration mingled. They realized that the woman they had once mocked in showers had not only survived Hell Week alongside them, but had dominated it, guided them, and reshaped their understanding of leadership, discipline, and teamwork. Transformation was underway, subtle, unrelenting, and irreversible. And Lieutenant Commander Rachel Halden, seated quietly in her room, allowed herself a brief, private smile. The mutiny had been averted. Ego had been humbled. Respect had been earned. And the real work, shaping these men into warriors, had only just begun. The pre-dawn chill hung over the beach like a living thing, damp fog weaving between jagged cliffs and the restless surf. Recruits lined up, muscles trembling from 6 relentless days of Hell Week, minds raw from exhaustion and mental strain. They had survived, yes, but survival had transformed them. Arrogance had been tempered by humility, fear replaced with discipline, and confusion replaced with focus. And at the center of this transformation stood Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Halden, the SEAL they had once mocked, laughed at, and underestimated, now the undisputed architect of their endurance and skill. The final mission had been announced the previous evening, a full-scale simulated assault across treacherous terrain, complete with timed objectives, strategic challenges, live fire simulations, and split-second decisions. Failure would not only reveal physical weaknesses, but expose poor judgment, poor leadership, and fractured teamwork. Ray had spent hours designing the operation, mapping every detail, and observing each recruit's strengths and limitations. This would be the ultimate test, not just of their bodies, but of their minds, their courage, and their ability to follow command under pressure. Briggs, still nursing his bruised ego, stood near the front of the formation. He had been humbled, disciplined, and quietly reshaped by Ray's authority, but uncertainty lingered. Could he lead effectively now? Could he truly trust her judgment and control under extreme stress? His pride was tempered, but tension still coiled in his chest, warning him that this mission would demand everything he had learned and more. The other recruits, equally fatigued and apprehensive, mirrored his anxiety in subtle ways. They were ready to follow, yet their own fears whispered constantly of failure and exhaustion. "Listen up," Ray's voice rang out, calm, precise, and commanding, cutting through the low roar of the ocean. "This mission is your final evaluation. Every decision matters. Every movement is critical. Mistakes will be noted. Success will be earned. You will work in teams, with roles assigned based on your strengths and weaknesses observed over the past week. Trust your training. Trust your team. Trust me. Move out." Her tone brooked no hesitation. The recruits straightened instinctively, muscles coiled for action, minds focused entirely on the challenge ahead. The first phase was a timed infiltration across rugged cliffs, navigating through narrow ledges and unstable ground. The recruits moved with a precision they had never achieved before, silent, coordinated, aware of every misstep, every shadow, every risk. Ray observed closely, occasionally whispering instructions or subtle corrections, her presence guiding without overt control. The recruits' training, honed under her meticulous supervision, was evident. Movements were fluid, errors minimized, and teamwork emerging from the chaos like a living organism. Midway through the cliff phase, a sudden simulated explosion, carefully controlled, yet perfectly timed, sent sand and gravel cascading around them. Panic might have erupted under normal circumstances, but Ray's calm authority had reshaped them. They ducked, rolled, and regrouped seamlessly, demonstrating split-second decision-making under pressure. Briggs's team, once disjointed and reckless, now moved in perfect synchronization, adjusting to environmental hazards, covering one another's flanks, and executing precise maneuvers that would have been impossible at the start of Hell Week. Next came the assault across the surf zone, timed and strategically complex. The ocean roared, waves crashing against rocks, tides shifting unpredictably. The recruits navigated through the turbulent water, carrying weighted packs, simulated equipment, and vital objectives. Each movement demanded balance, strength, and unwavering focus. Ray remained on the cliffs, observing, silently judging, and guiding only when mistakes threatened to compromise the mission. Her eyes swept over every individual, assessing stamina, mental fortitude, and the ability to execute under extreme stress. Halfway through the surf, a recruit began to struggle, his strength faltering under the current and weight. Without hesitation, Ray descended the rocks with the speed and precision of a seasoned operator, reaching the struggling man within seconds. Her hands steadied him, her calm voice cutting through panic. "Focus, breathe, adjust your stance. Move with the team." Under her guidance, he recovered, regaining composure and completing the segment. The other recruits watched, all replacing fear, witnessing her mastery firsthand. The silent legend of Ray Halden had been cemented in their minds. She was more than a leader. She was a lifeline, a force, and an unshakable standard. By midday, the recruits faced the simulated enemy stronghold, the final challenge of the mission. Objectives were clear: infiltrate, secure, and extract with minimal losses. Communications were limited. Mistakes were unforgiving. Exhaustion clawed at every muscle. Yet the transformation was visible. Teams moved as cohesive units, every man anticipating his partner, every action deliberate, every decision informed by lessons Ray had painstakingly instilled over the past week. The once mocked individuals now operated with lethal precision, aware of consequences, disciplined in execution, and confident in their growing abilities. Briggs, leading a critical flank, felt a rush of clarity. The lessons Ray had enforced, humility, precision, teamwork, patience, crystallized into instinct. He guided his team effectively, anticipating threats, communicating silently, and adjusting strategy on the fly. When simulated hazards emerged, falling debris, rogue obstacles, and sudden enemy maneuvers, he executed flawlessly. His respect for Ray deepened. She had not only reformed him, but transformed him into a competent, reliable leader. The final extraction required coordination across all teams, simultaneous timing, and flawless execution. Ray oversaw the operation from a vantage point, her sharp eyes tracking every movement. Subtle corrections here, precise commands there, and her calm assurance kept chaos at bay. The recruits executed the maneuver as one unit, seamlessly moving through danger, securing objectives, and extracting without incident. The culmination of 6 days of exhaustive Hell Week, her guidance, and their transformation was complete. When the teens regrouped on the beach, the atmosphere was electric. Exhaustion, relief, pride, and awe mingled in the salty air. Ray approached, surveying her recruits silently for a moment before speaking. You have survived Hell Week. You have adapted, learned, and grown. What you have accomplished today is not just survival, it is mastery. Remember this: discipline, focus, and trust in leadership will carry you through the most impossible situations. You are no longer the same men who mocked me in the showers. You are ready. Her calm, commanding tone carried finality, authority, and undeniable pride. The recruits, battered but transformed, looked at her with eyes wide with respect and awe. Silence reigned for a moment. Then Briggs stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. Commander, I underestimated you, and I respect you. Other men nodded in agreement, voices hushed, the words heavy with humility and admiration. The transformation had reached completion, mockery replaced with loyalty, arrogance tempered by respect, weakness refined into competence. Ray's mission, both explicit and unspoken, had been accomplished. Night descended on the base as the recruits returned to barracks. Muscles burned, bodies ached, but spirits were high. The silent laughter of the past had been replaced with reflective discussion, recounting lessons learned, mistakes corrected, and growth achieved. Ray, sitting quietly in her quarters, reviewed mental notes one last time, cataloging observations, strengths, weaknesses, and leadership potential. The recruits were transformed, prepared, and aware of the standard she embodied. The ocean waves whispered outside her window, relentless, exacting, and eternal, a mirror of the training she had administered. Hell Week was complete. The mockery, laughter, and arrogance of the first days had been replaced by respect, discipline, and loyalty. And as Ray allowed herself a moment of reflection, she knew one immutable truth. The mission had not only tested them, it had proven them. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Halden had led her team through impossible physical and mental challenges, transforming mockery into respect, chaos into order, and weakness into strength. And as the first stars appeared over the Pacific horizon, she allowed herself the briefest, almost imperceptible smile. The recruits who had once laughed in the showers were no longer boys. They were warriors, and they had her to thank for it. The morning after the final mission, the beach was quiet, bathed in golden sunlight that shimmered off the waves. The recruits, exhausted yet transformed, moved through their routines with a precision and confidence that had been absent just a week before. Every step, every glance, every motion carried the imprint of the leadership that had forged them. They no longer stumbled blindly, no longer hesitated in the face of challenge. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Ray Halden had left her mark on each of them, invisibly yet indelibly, like a sculptor carving strength from raw stone. Briggs, once the loudest and most arrogant among them, walked silently along the shoreline, reflecting on the past days. His pride, bruised and humbled, had been reshaped into respect and awareness. He remembered the early days, mocking, scoffing, challenging authority, and he felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. Ray had not humiliated him, had not crushed him with anger. Instead, she had guided him, observed him, and allowed him to confront his own weaknesses. He had survived Hell Week, but more importantly, he had grown because of it. The other recruits, clustered in small groups, shared quiet conversations. Some spoke of the physical pain they had endured, others of the mental strain. But all spoke in hushed tones of Ray's presence, the calm, unyielding authority that had reshaped them. They spoke of the drills, the exercises, the moments when disaster had threatened, and how she had intervened with precision, insight, and skill. She had been invisible yet omnipresent, silent yet commanding, gentle yet unbreakable. And they had learned that leadership was more than words. It was actions, observation, guidance, and unwavering presence. Ray herself moved among the men, her posture relaxed but still commanding. She nodded subtly to those who had shown resilience, adjusted a posture here, offered a quiet word of encouragement there. Her eyes swept over the group, noting improvements, assessing potential, and storing mental notes for the future. To an outsider, she might have appeared calm and ordinary, but the recruits saw the reflection of battles fought, experience earned, and the weight of authority carried with grace and precision. Briggs approached her cautiously, head bowed slightly, the last remnants of arrogance tempered by respect. "Commander," he said quietly, "thank you. We owe you more than we realize. You didn't just lead us through Hell Week, you taught us how to lead ourselves." Ray's expression softened just enough to acknowledge the sincerity in his voice. "Leadership," she replied, calm and steady, "isn't something I give. It's something you discover under pressure, through challenge, and by facing your own weaknesses. You've all done that. Remember it." The men fell silent, absorbing the weight of her words. Silence, once filled with laughter, mockery, or defiance, was now a companion of reflection. Each recruit considered their journey, from arrogance to humility, from confusion to awareness, from doubt to respect. Hell Week had tested them physically, mentally, and emotionally. But Ray had tested something deeper: character, resilience, and the capacity to learn from those who commanded with wisdom rather than fear. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Ray gathered the recruits for the final debrief. Standing at the head of the formation, she addressed them with the quiet authority that had defined every day of the week. "You have completed Hell Week. You have been tested in ways most cannot imagine. You have faced exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. Some of you failed temporarily, some succeeded consistently, but all of you have grown. Remember this lesson. Respect is earned, discipline is practiced, and leadership is a responsibility, not a reward. Carry it with you beyond this training, and it will serve you in every mission to come." The recruits nodded, some with eyes glistening from fatigue and pride, others simply with the quiet acknowledgement of hard-won understanding. They understood now that Hell Week was more than a test of endurance. It was a crucible in which they had been forged, and Ray Halden had been the architect of that transformation. The woman they had mocked in showers, laughed at in drills, and underestimated at every turn, had become a symbol of excellence, strength, and unassailable authority. As the group dispersed, the recruits paused to glance back at Ray. Briggs lingered for a moment, watching her stand tall, quiet, yet commanding. He realized that the lessons they had learned were not just about physical skill or tactical knowledge. They were about humility, awareness, teamwork, and the subtle art of leadership. Ray had not simply commanded them. She had transformed them into individuals capable of self-discipline, effective leadership, and unwavering respect for authority. Ray returned to her quarters, listening to the rhythmic crash of the Pacific waves. The past week replayed in her mind. The early mockery, the whispered doubts, the silent observations, the subtle interventions, and the final transformative mission. Each day had tested her patience, precision, and leadership. And each day had succeeded in shaping these men into something stronger, sharper, and more capable than when they had arrived. She allowed herself a rare, quiet smile, satisfaction, tempered with the knowledge that the real world would challenge these men even further, and they were now better prepared to face it. Outside, the recruits continued to reflect, sharing quiet moments of camaraderie, recounting lessons learned, and silently acknowledging the woman who had guided them through their transformation. They had entered Hell Week as overconfident, inexperienced, and naive. They left as disciplined, aware, and resilient, capable of following command, making difficult decisions under pressure, and respecting authority earned through skill rather than demanded through fear. Weeks later, Ray's influence remained evident. The recruits continued training, but the lessons she instilled carried forward. Teamwork strengthened, mistakes analyzed constructively, leadership exercised responsibly. The memory of the woman who had once been mocked, who had silently observed, corrected, and guided, became a standard to measure themselves against. Her authority was no longer questioned. Her presence, her methods, and her skill had transformed them irrevocably. And as Ray Halden walked along the beach one final time before departing the base, she paused to watch the waves, reflecting on the week's challenges and triumphs. The mockery, laughter, and doubt had long since faded. In their place were respect, discipline, and the quiet recognition of excellence. She knew that leadership was a living thing, nurtured through action, observation, and experience. She had given them a foundation, but the men themselves would carry it forward, strengthened by the crucible she had imposed. Her gaze swept the horizon, the ocean endless, the sky vast. She thought of her brother's voice, echoing from memory. Lead them, Ray. Make them count. She had done just that. The recruits had counted, and they had grown, molded by the precise, unyielding hand of a SEAL commander who demanded the very best from herself and those under her care. The final lesson of Hell Week was clear. Mockery, arrogance, and doubt could be overcome by skill, patience, and unwavering leadership. The men who had laughed in the showers were now warriors, disciplined, aware, and transformed. And standing above it all, Rachel Halden, Lieutenant Commander, SEAL, mentor, and architect of their growth, knew that this was only the beginning. The beach fell silent once more, the waves crashing against the shore, relentless, eternal, and exacting, a fitting reflection of the woman who had guided them through the impossible, transformed their fear into respect, and left an indelible mark on every man she led. The legacy of Lieutenant Commander Rachel Halden was now cemented, not in words, but in action, discipline, and the quiet, enduring strength of those she had forged.